environment like this, mining companies in particular need to get their elbows on the table. And the bottom line really is that relationships are super critical at this point in time, because it's the relationships, it is the political intelligence gathering that's really going to be helpful in crafting business strategy, and whether it's permitting strategies or whatever it might be. And I spent a long time working with PDAC, got very well introduced to the sector. And what was very, very apparent to me even then,
Welcome to Ore-atory. Today my guest is Steve Virtue, who is an executive consultant with over a decade of experience in the mining industry, helping companies and industry groups navigate sort of the messy space where politics, risk, and community all collide. He's held senior roles at Yamana Gold, PDAC, and Smart Centers, where he's advised CEOs, premiers, cabinet ministers, and international stakeholders on everything from permitting and ESG to political risk and stakeholder engagement. Welcome, Steve. We're so excited to have you today.
Thanks, Lindsey. I appreciate you having me. A big fan of the podcast, and I feel very honored to be here with you today.
Thank you. I like to remind myself that everybody has a podcast these days. And so how do we stand out? And then what do we get to talk about? And just pre-recording, you and I were talking about, is it my dog that gets to pop in? Is it that you were once a drummer and that there's another Steve Virtue out there? How do we make our listeners want to listen other than talking about really exciting things like we get to today? I never know what the hidden trick is.
That's very true. I think I was chatting with a friend of mine, and we were going to create a podcast based on surveying all of the Spanish-inspired Mexican restaurants in Toronto. And I said we would have to call it the Mex Files, a play on the X-Files, of course. And yeah, so we haven't quite got there. I do not have my own podcast. I've been on a few, but I appreciate your time today because this is very important, very interesting stuff to talk about.
I'm really excited about what we get to talk about today because I was just in New York at the CTMF conference, and I feel like the topics that you and I get to cover this week were very much on center stage there in terms of what's happening politically and how is that affecting our ability to permit, our ability to attract talent to the industry, our ability to create investment and knowledge about what we're doing in the mining industry in a more broad circle or outside of the silo of who we get to talk to on a routine basis. So I guess to lead us in to some of what we get to talk about today, how would you describe the current geopolitical climate and its impact on the mining industry?
Wow, let's start with a small question and ease our way in.
I know.
I think if we put it all in context, right? Last year in 2024, there were 75 national and federal level elections that affected more than 4 billion people globally. This year, we're expecting almost the same number of elections. And in particular for the mining industry, we're looking at federal and national level elections for Chile, for Argentina, Canada. We just had ours here. We have a new prime minister, but the same party. And so we're going to have to untangle a lot of that. And one of the challenges, and where people like me can be really beneficial for a mining company, is that most of those governments have changed. The security of incumbency was lost, and we saw in more than 75% of these jurisdictions where the sitting party either lost or substantially reduced power. And what we're seeing is a wholesale exchange of values, of principles, of priorities. And this is causing titanic shifts, as we see every day, in trade relationships that will cascade from foreign policy, but also into domestic policy. And I think watching certainly what's happening with President Trump in the United States and how critical minerals, and I would expand the definition of critical minerals to also include energy production, and it's driving foreign policy like we've never seen before, and it is having enormous consequences for countries like Canada, for Mexico, for China, for India. And there is not only all of this change, but it's coming at such a dramatic high velocity. In an environment like this, mining companies in particular need to get their elbows on the table, I think, and the bottom line really is that relationships are super critical at this point in time, because it's the relationships, it is the political intelligence gathering that's really going to be helpful in crafting business strategy, and whether it's permitting strategies or whatever it might be. And I spent a long time working with PDAC, got very well introduced to the sector. And what was very, very apparent to me even then was that mining companies are not particularly keen on that. They don't like being involved. There's this whole metaphor of mining companies being gophers, right? So if they pop their head up over over the threshold, it was likely to get shot off. And this is really a critical juncture to climb up out of that sort of metaphoric gopher hole and get in the room. Mining companies, there was just 2 weeks ago, 40 mining companies were in Washington talking about mining policy, talking about critical minerals, talking about uranium and lithium and all of those critical things on the horizon. And how is it changing policy? Yeah, huge. This is a prescient time in our history. And when before in our lifetimes has mining ever lived on the front page the way it is now?
Yeah. I think with that, there's so much opportunity, right? It feels daunting to really put some numbers that you just shared, right? That many elections, that much change. And we've certainly all noticed the every day something new coming into the news that we have to pay attention to. But I don't know that, as you said, that we've seen something about mining on the front page as often as we are at present. And as you mentioned, several weeks ago, we had all these leaders in Washington talking about it. Women's Mining Coalition from the U.S. was there. There were a number of mining companies there. And having conversations with many who attended that, they said, look, we finally had an audience. We had good conversations. They were receptive to what we were saying. But I agree with you, where virtue is necessary for so many of our clients and groups out there is to truly take stake and understand the ramifications of popping your head up and saying, hey, I'm a mining company. What does this mean? How do I influence policy and change and the ability to get something done that we all really need domestically, globally, etc.? It doesn't matter from my perspective at this moment, but we need to have a much broader audience that's receptive to what we're doing so that we can actually get something done rather than be blocked at every critical pass. And so I'm excited sort of that there's this going on, but also I think generally I feel like we're ill prepared as an industry to have some of these broader conversations about what does this mean politically.
Agreed. And I think there are some organizations that are trying to make sense of it. There are some organizations, whether they are mining associations or business sort of leadership groups, but I think it's really difficult to underscore the volume of change that is happening. President Trump has taken, metaphorically, a bit of a grenade and thrown it into the world trade sort of framework that we've understood and been comfortable with for 40 years. Yeah. And it has completely upset the balance. And now we're having to renegotiate and reshape a lot of those conversations. And Canada, for its size and its scale on the world stage, we operate as a G7 country. But the reality is that we have the most trade relationships of any country in the world. But we've become so complacent as a country, relying so heavily, for a variety of reasons, on our relationship with the United States. And now what we're seeing is that relationship, we can't count on it the same way that we used to. And so all of these other international relationships, Brazil is a market of 250 million people that we need to do more to cultivate better, stronger relationships with. And I think we'll probably talk about that more in the podcast, but it's really time for Canada in particular, but also other countries to really think strategically about how they want to operate. And for, as to your point, mining companies, this creates an enormous opportunity, but you've got to get in the room, you've got to have a plan, and you've got to have those relationships.
100%. And as I'm looking at the questions that I am supposed to ask you, I have about 1,000 others that I want to ask you. So I'm going to try to stay as focused as I can, which, as many of my listeners will attest to, that sometimes that's better than others. So I guess leaving off on that note, let's go back to Canada, because I feel like you said some interesting things there. Canada has the most trade relationships of any country, which is new information to me. I'm not a Canadian, so perhaps this is better known there, but that's a really interesting thing. Since you've worked internationally and you are in Canada, and we have so many global mining companies hubbed in Canada, how do Canadian companies help pave the way for others? And how do are they falling behind now? Are they leading the way? What does this really look like, and how can they do better?
That is a complicated question.
Sorry, Steve.
No, it's a lot to unpack, right? Yeah. I think as Canadians, for the better part of a century, we have prided ourselves on our kind of dominance as miners, right? Canadian mining companies were always the best in the world. If you look at reputation, if you look at ESG reporting, if you look at number of incidences, Canadian mining companies are always by far the leaders in this category, leaders in technological development, leaders in the mining service and supply industry. The challenge we've faced is that over the last decade in particular, we've had federal governments here in Canada who've really not paid attention to that. There's been some deterioration. There was the global pandemic, and the Canadian mining leadership has really eroded. And I think it is an enormous challenge. And what have we been doing? We take all these trade relationships, and I've been a part of some of these conversations where we've spent the last 10 years with the Liberal government trying to be a bit of a social influencer on the world's morality. And that has not necessarily, because and I literally have been in these conversations with members of the Foreign Service from different countries who said, who is Canada to try and influence how we do business here? And that's really been met with some resistance. And taking aside the importance and the significance of these conversations, and I don't want to undermine those conversations, right? It's just a question of, is it the right time? Is it the right place? Whether they're Canadian or American businesses looking to create opportunities internationally, they struggle when that's the entry conversation. And what you're left with is a situation where we need substantial change here, right? Because what we're seeing in jurisdictions like the United States, like Argentina, like Saudi Arabia, is they're being incredibly aggressive on mining policy. They're being very forthright in terms of putting money on the table to make substantial change, to become leaders in this sector. And so we're still 2 steps behind. I can tell you now, our Prime Minister is floating a piece of legislation amongst some key stakeholders that they have yet to introduce, but they will, called, I think the working title is the Canadian Economy Bill. And it is really designed to move major infrastructure projects, including mining. It is looking at special economic zones where certain environmental or labor legislation may not be as applicable, and where the federal government would take a more progressive and active role in negotiations with Indigenous communities across the country. And maybe those things should have been done a decade ago with a mind to be more progressive. But conversely, it goes back to that sort of gopher mentality. Here in Toronto and in Ontario, the jurisdiction where I live, we had an opportunity here to modernize our Mining Act regulations. In speaking with the Minister's office, there was definitely a tone that the mining companies and the mining associations could have and should have been more progressive. We wanted state-of-the-art leading regulation, and really what we got was not that. It was like a small step forward. And listen, all bets are off right now, and I think there's a tremendous opportunity. And as we started off with the show, you've got to get in the room, you've got to have these conversations. And I, having obviously worked in mining, lots of engineers, lots of lawyers, lots of financiers who don't always have the appetite for the circuitous nature of kind of the politics in the world and the ecosystems where I tend to live. But again, if you're not in those rooms, if you're not in those conversations, how are your needs going to get looked after?
Yeah, and I think that what we're recognizing more and more is that ESG, for instance, has brought the need to become a bit political into the spectrum, right? And so if we can't get a mine permitted, it doesn't matter how much money a company raises if it's going to be blocked at every turn, right? And so I think over the last 10 plus years, we've recognized that ESG was one of those leading forces that said, hey, you have to become political, not just so that you can find jobs or get an advantageous tax rate or whatever the case may be. You have to be in these rooms because if you want to make something happen, you have to follow these rules. And sometimes they're reasonable and sometimes they're not. But I always think about this because, and as this was reinforced in my meetings last week in New York, companies can have money and they can have great ideas and there can be protocols and there can be all kinds of stuff. But if you don't have a seat at the table and you don't know how to navigate this political ecosystem, you may not be successful. And there are risks that you can control and there are risks that are completely out of your control. And from my perspective, if you start figuring out how to navigate some of the political ecosystem, more of that becomes within your control.
100%.
Yep.
Absolutely. Think to the ESG lens in particular, right? And you think about where are we going to be? I think President Trump has talked about maybe making some alterations and reducing some of the requirements in relation to ESG. I'm not sure that mining companies will need to follow that or want to follow that. I think they need to keep the highest level of authenticity. A word that gets thrown around a lot, but it really is powerful with key stakeholders, and that is trust. Yes. And while I worked with Yamana, this is not uncommon with so many mining companies, the website is investor focused. And so I had a conversation with our president and our executive chairman, and I said, I really think there's an opportunity here. We're doing so much good work in the communities. It would be great to layer in some of these stories, not that we're writing, but that other people are writing for us, about us, and that mention us, because there are stakeholder groups, not the least of which are government, but also community activists, to say, is this company a good actor? And can you show me evidence of that? And by being able to articulate that and through other people's words, it's a powerful tool. But it really goes back to that word trust, right? And I think my experience, in particular working with elected officials and senior officials in government as well, differentiation being, of course, the elected versus the unelected, is that the trust quotient is so critical because they have so many things that they need to deal with on any given day. They want to be able to empower you to go and do whatever it is that you're going to do with minimal risk to the communities, minimal risk to the environment, and with minimal risk to their political legacy. Yeah. And they want to have those trusting partnerships. We'll, I'm sure, revisit this theme. The days of this transactional relationship of give me a permit and go away no longer exists. It is no longer sufficient. And I've had politicians tell me this. They want to know what's happening. They want to have relationships with you that are more than just, again, these transactional things, because it's important for them to understand what values you're bringing. And the one thing I certainly learned working with Yamana, I mean, they were on the cusp of being a senior gold producer, and that's a bit of a tangent, but in many cases, you see how mining companies are building public infrastructure. They're building roads, they're building hydro, they're building dams, they're building desalination plants, they're building public infrastructure all over the world. And in some cases, what you see, less so in North America, is this abrogation of responsibility by local governments to say, that should be our job. We're going to let the mining company do it. Think about during the pandemic, how many mining companies turned their health and safety teams into public health and safety teams who were administering vaccines. They were turning the facilities that they had in these remote and rural communities into public health centers and all kinds of things just because it was the right thing to do. And mining reputationally has always had a struggle. It's been an uphill battle, but those are the kinds of stories that, again, are so powerful in terms of being able to communicate these things. Even ongoing mining companies who have firefighting teams or safety teams that can go out into a community beyond their perimeter. Really important for politicians and for stakeholders to understand these stories.
I couldn't agree more, Steve. And I feel like beyond that, it also helps attract the future workforce, right? Because if you're not telling these stories, if you're not sharing some of the successes, you're not building that trust in communities local to the mines and beyond, then there isn't a future population that says, hey, let me raise my hand and go into the mining industry. And tangent for me, we don't have enough people. So telling a better story not only creates trust within the governments and that runway for us to operate, it also brings in talent. It also brings in investment. This is a winning strategy, and traditionally we're very poor at it. And I think we could go in a very different direction. But staying as focused, again, as I possibly can, I think one of the questions I want to ask, because I think that sometimes when we're looking internally to our own organizations and what we're doing, sometimes it takes hearing it from an outside perspective to recognize that we're doing it and a solution. And so I'm not expecting necessarily a solution, but let's talk about perhaps some of the biggest misconceptions that mining companies or miners have about political risk and how maybe we mitigate that a little bit. So mitigate, we don't have to go into, but what are the misconceptions?
Wow, that's a big question. And I think I would break that into two things.
Okay.
When you talk about political risk, I think most of the mining companies, I'm not talking about the Rios and Tex, they have big infrastructure, right? They've got teams of people that look at this sort of thing. Even in the mid-tiers and certainly within the junior category, there's this idea that risk really only happens in unstable countries. And we know that's not the case, right? To take your example about labor, here in Quebec, we have real dearth of skilled talent. And so the risk profile is increased because there aren't enough people in the space. And a guy goes as a, I don't know, jumbo operator or something in mine, waits 6 months, gets a promotion, moves to mine, gets a promotion, and keeps rotating. And it's the same sort of workforce. The federal and provincial governments are quite concerned about this. I think looking at technology as a way to mitigate that, and a corollary to that is really when you think about mining companies worrying about tariffs and looking at the bigger sort of geopolitical issues we're facing right now, I think a lot of them are taking this wait and see attitude. And this is a real challenge because it's the juniors who have faced 10 years of underinvestment, who haven't been doing the exploration, and the unmatched expectation of your government, who I've had these conversations where they think we could get a mine up and running from early stage exploration to development and production in 2 years. And there are these mismatches. But there is the whole undercurrent of the mining supply and service sector. All those companies who are doing the drilling and who are doing the blasting, all these companies have really, because there hasn't been as much activity, are starting to dwindle, and we're seeing retirements. So from a risk profile, from a cost profile, I think mining companies need to be very concerned about, even in the most developed countries, this is a challenge. And I would say secondarily that politics, I've had mining CEOs express this to me, is that politics is an ecosystem we don't like to play in. And this is a recurrent theme, right? Is it why guys like me are important? Because you've got the stomach for it. But this notion that political risk is something that you monitor, not something that you actively manage. And I think investors are getting smarter, and they are seeing that Canada, which is a great jurisdiction to invest in, but it takes forever to get anything done. The British Columbia government has said that they're ready and willing to fast track all kinds of projects. $90 billion worth of projects are ready. We're going to fast track them. But again, they've been sitting on the shelf for 10 years. 17 projects alone was $35 billion worth of investment that has just sat for 10 years without the sort of the approvals to move ahead. And listen, I've spent my entire career working with political leaders and with CEOs. And my job is to often do the translation between the two to say, let's help mitigate risk on both sides of the equation. Let's find a common story. Because I think mining companies also think this is an operational context I'm not interested in because it's messy, it takes too long, they don't understand us and we don't understand them. And like I said, a lot of what I do is a cultural interpretation to help bring two sides together.
Which is, from my perspective, so necessary. And we wind up seeing that in a variety of areas, but I think this is going to be one that we have to face as we move forward. And I think you brought up a few really resounding points to me, and one of those is acting as a translator and the go-between so that you can create win-win scenarios for both sides. And that alone just is such a nice thing to hear, because I think as you said, we try to stay out of it. And so it's like, who do we pass this off to? Who can manage this for us so that we can go be geologists or engineers or a CEO or whatever it is, whether it's a big company or a small company? And I just see a lot of value in that, because it is a very nuanced sort of thing that has to be managed. And we don't all have the skills for that.
No, and I think yeah, no, it's absolutely true, right? And when my kids ask me, what exactly do you do for a living? And it's generally at bedtime. It's a great way to put them to sleep, because you start talking and immediately they fall asleep. But I think it's so often because it's a milieu that a lot of people, they don't understand. And I would say on our side of the equation, public affairs professionals don't do a good job of describing how they can help, and how, for example, somebody like me can go in and help on the corporate development side in risk management, how we can make sense of an international trade war and how it's going to impact supply chains. And these are the kinds of things where, again, I keep going back to this idea of how important relationships are. And as with Yamana, we had an issue where we couldn't get product out of the country. Our legal team tried, and everybody in the organization tried. And then finally, I guess the CEO called me and said, do you know anybody? Can you do anything about this? And so I said, let me call the ambassador. And we had a conversation. I bought the ambassador a $15 coffee at the local coffee shop. He signed the piece of paper, and that was worth $45 million to us. And it's how do you articulate that in a way that those are difficult things. But if you don't have that relationship, that doesn't get done.
Well, you've worked to build the trust and manage the relationship, and therefore having that conversation make sense. They'll take the call, they'll show up for the meeting, and
Sure.
things get done. And we undervalue that because we don't know how to make it happen ourselves, right? And so it's, oh, of course they say that they can do that, and that seems really easy, but it's not. It's cultivating this for quite some time. And I think the idea that you keep going back to is relationships. The idea that I keep going back to with all of this is trust and risk and managing both of those in a way that allows you to have those relationships.
Yeah, I was going to say 100%. And I think that with so many mining CEOs, their stakeholder ecosystem rightly is the investor ecosystem, right? You work very closely with your CFO to build that trust, build those relationships, to sell your dream. And my discussion is always, don't let these other things become a distraction to you doing the job that you need to do as CEO, and let me help you manage all this other kind of superfluous stuff, which can shut down a project. It can halt an investment, and it can make significant issues happen in very quick order.
Yeah, 1,000%. You said the magic word, so it's triggering. You said trade and supply chain, and we've struggled with supply chain since COVID and perhaps even before that, but trade wars and supply chain, I think let's start aiming that direction. As I realize we've gone 30 minutes or so already, and we could probably talk for the entire day about what I've got lined up for us. So I'm just trying to this is my hit list of questions for you, Steve. I think in terms of trade dynamics, we've got some interesting things at play. Obviously, here in the US, we've changed some policies, which is manifesting everywhere else as well. But the US-China tensions and the idea of some resource nationalism, how is that influencing decisions for mining companies? Like, what is happening there in terms of how they respond and react from your perspective?
100%. This is the $1 million or $1 billion question, right? We're seeing a full reshaping of the global trade network. As I said earlier, we've become very comfortable over the last 40 years believing that global trade integration has been a productive outcome. And I think the reality of what we're seeing is that if there were three things that I would point to, is that one, I'm not sure that Russia was ever fully integrated into the sort of global economy for a number of reasons. And China, although fully economically integrated, we missed the boat because I think there were some expectations around political integration and political ideology, and that hasn't happened. And then I think the third sort of piece of that is that we're still living with these decades-old ideals. And I think you can see that in some of the things that President Trump says, as an example, around our idealism around how do we advance our own interests. And I think, so when it comes to that, President Trump in particular has kicked this thing off by completely destabilizing everything we've known. And how is that going to affect the flow of capital? How is that going to affect the foreign and domestic policies? And again, as we've seen, President Trump alone had come forward and said, anybody willing to invest $1 billion, we will move all heaven and earth to make projects happen quickly. And there is an expectation in Washington that lithium projects and copper projects and these things can happen exponentially faster than they ever have before. And I think that there's a real Wild West behavior or attitude towards that, even so much so that it's making the mining industry a little bit uncomfortable because they see that there's the opportunity, but they're not sure exactly how that's going to work because we've had 25 years of, to your point earlier, around ESG and stakeholder engagement, stakeholder consultation, and we're used to doing business in a certain way. And now it's all been thrown up in the air. And I think that's really important. And so I think for so many mining companies, and again, we've seen a decade of this patient capital idea where people haven't been investing, we haven't been doing the exploration that we may have needed to be doing. And mining companies are going to move a little bit more cautiously and perhaps with looking at different environments geographically as to say, where is the best place for me to invest my money? Because there is so much turmoil right now. And again, I've seen the enthusiasm with which, governments in Argentina and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia examples that I've mentioned before, but this is really reshaping and retooling the mining industry. But even in terms of investment flows, offtake agreements, and the locations that companies choose are all now, I think, being pinned a little bit more to geopolitical realities. And I think that's really a fundamental shift. I grew up in the sector where the geology was, you can't change that. And that these other risks, you just have to manage them. And now I think there's some different thoughts in terms of exactly what the potential risk is there. I
wanted to tag on to a few things that you said that we've talked about a few times now. One, I want to come back to Saudi Arabia. But before we do that, talking a bit about how the expectation in Washington or through our governments is that we hit the on switch and all of a sudden we have the minerals, right? Or a mine. And that is just obviously not the reality. And as you said, I think because the investment has been slow, because there has been this timeline, the time from discovery to actually having a producing mine in the US, I saw a statistic that's 27 years on average.
And getting longer.
And getting longer, right? Even if you've got all of the things you think checked off. Rosemont, I think, was a great story for us to learn from. And that dates back 10 years, and they're still working on getting things going there. And you can think you've done everything right, and it still doesn't quite go off. And, excuse me, but I think the other part of this that you mentioned, regardless of how we change some of our policies and what permitting looks like and the promises that Washington will meet us where we need to be so we can create mines and meet the need, it's not realistic for so many reasons. And I think what's encouraging to me is that most of the individuals in our industry, being mining, is that they all agree that we have very little runway to screw up in terms of ESG or how we operate from a people and environment perspective. And so that is great, because regardless of where we're at with this administration or changes, I think we continue having to do the right things and put those best practices into place. And most individuals are for it. And bad things still happen. However, I think that we're doing the best that we can to create a better runway for us into the future. And so it's interesting to me that we just don't quite have all of the rest of the resources in line. We can't get everything done as fast as they may think, but that's been a misalignment of anybody that's invested in the mining industry previously that was not part of it. And they're like, why does it take 10 years? Why am I not going to see a return on my investment in X amount of time? And I think we've seen this lull in investment for years and years because we wind up having that same pool to go to because they're familiar with it, they're comfortable with it, they understand that it takes a long time. And now all of a sudden we've tipped this on its head and said we need to hit the go button, and we don't have a clear roadmap on how to make it go. That's my rant.
Yeah, no, listen, it's that characterization of the sector is absolutely true. What I would say is also bookend that with, we have talked about this a little bit, but the challenges in supply chain and the ready availability of the service and supply sector to step in, because they're often the first ones on the ground and they are shrinking as a base. They've moved offshore because of cost, different environmental operational challenges. And then on the back end, you've also got processing facilities that just don't exist, smelters and all the rest. And so, well, where is that going to come from? How long would it take to permit a smelter in Canada or the United States? You're talking decades. And so everything is being processed in China and Africa, where the regulatory environment is probably not as significant or as severe. And so how do we want to think about that? Because it's one thing to say we're going to dig a hole in the ground, take all this stuff and process it, and then it'll be in somebody's iPhone in a week. But the reality is it just doesn't happen. And I think that's where there's been a real critical breakdown in the communication on behalf of the mining industries to government officials, and all, equally as importantly, opposition leaders, about the ability to move quickly and to say, this is where we need to go and this is what it's going to take to get there. And I think we've seen that in Canada, the United States, we've seen it in Argentina, we've seen it in Chile, we've seen it throughout Africa, about this ability to be nimble and move quickly. And this is something where you talk about international diplomacy and geopolitical tension, and this is exactly where China has just bulldozed their way through into the mining sector and have become the leaders in critical minerals because they're not letting things like that stand in their way.
Absolutely. And last week, Kai Hoffman was one of the speakers in New York, and he put up a graph, and I wish I had it, about essentially all of the processing that happens through China and why the result of tariffs and some of the international trade policies are prohibitive for us, essentially, to making all of this work. And so it's a really interesting graph. I'll have to find it and share it after the fact. But we are all aware of some of these issues, and it's just how do we reconcile it and keep things moving forward. But I wanted to touch on Saudi Arabia because I think what they've been doing deliberately and really interestingly is there, what is it called, the 2030 plan or something like that. I'm going to launch off without much of a question, but just aim that way for you to take the lead on this, because I think they will become a much bigger player. They have the money, they have the people, they have the appetite for it, and I think that we're about to see a whole lot of things change in our industry as they become more involved. And go.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think more involved in so many different aspects, right? I think we all think the finance, and that's 100% true. But I think it's also they want their own production. They want minerals out of their own kind of territorial sort of regime. But this is also, they're looking internationally. They want to know how to invest and how to partake because they see that there's enormous opportunities, and the ability to move off of oil into critical minerals is just the next evolution. And in particular, in KSA, have had a great success with that and have been able to mobilize very quickly. And again, they're able to move at a speed and pace with which China can, but other countries can't. And I think that's where their nimbleness will be to their advantage. They might get frustrated by it because who wants to wait 27 years for a mine to come to fruition? But I think there's definitely a seat change in terms of how the mining industry finance works, the timelines, the permitting. And again, I mentioned it before, I think this idea that like what we're seeing from the federal government in Argentina is they are throwing, I don't want to say caution to the wind. It's still a very difficult environment to work in at the best of times. But the federal government and the provincial governments are working much more closely together, and they are wanting to become Lithium South, right? Yeah. They see the opportunities that were afforded to Chile through copper production, and they see lithium as their way out of considerable debt. And so it's really powerful. But we keep coming back to this idea of the relationships, and I think of how, again, as we talked about this subject in particular, was that there was just all these sort of misconceptions between governments and how things work. And while I was with Yamana, we had some dignitaries come up from Argentina. We had obviously a massive investment in Catamarca for the Mara project. Keep in mind, there was a weekly protest. They burned our building to the ground. So stakeholder sentiment wasn't really on our side in that sense. And we brought them up. And the mine, if I recall, was about 30 kilometers from kind of town. So they flew 4,000 miles. There we go. I'm mixing my measurements, but so whatever that is, 6,000 kilometers from Catamarca up to Toronto. They were up for PDAC. And then we flew them to Quebec. And we showed them on one side of the road, there was a mine, Canadian Malartic. And on the other side of the road, there was a community. And so it demonstrated to them very quickly that we were a good corporate citizen. We could manage dust and blasting and noise and all the rest of it, all those issues, and that some of the concerns that they had really were unfounded, and that we were a good player. They had some legitimate concerns in terms of the project and some of the history around Alumbrera, but the reality is that we were able to overcome a lot of those things by just having real conversations with them about what was realistic, what was feasible, what was going to push a project out of being economic. And so again, it's just having these conversations and understanding their pressure points, understanding what their desires were. And I eventually was sold and dissolved, but that project, is my understanding, is going ahead, and it's a great project. Like, it's a $3 billion copper project that I think has a lot of lifetime. And so to go from weekly protests to people signing up on a website, how do I get a job there, was a pretty remarkable shift, I think, in our strategy.
That's a huge success story, and I think we need to talk more about those. We need to talk about how we can live in the same community across from a mine, how we manage some of the concerns, water, dust, big trucks, whatever it is, being around that people are not accustomed to. But we deal with people building giant skyscrapers and construction traffic and all kinds of other things. And that's all essentially part of what we do in mining also. And it requires what we produce from mining. And so there's just, I think, a detachment from so many areas. How is it processed? Where does the material come from? How fast can it get done? And conversations that are real, but also meeting individuals where they're at and saying, hey, what questions do you have? Because if you just spout off with whatever it might be that you know about what you're doing well or right or anything else, that might not be what that individual needs to hear at that moment. And I think I crassly joke that like mining is more than drilling holes and breaking big rocks into small rocks, but we talk about it that way to one another. And I think if we talk about it in the way that we're expressing today, hey, these are relationships, it's trust, it's understanding what communities need, recognizing failures and successes, acknowledging them, taking responsibility for them, etc. How do we get investment? How do we educate? All of those sorts of things. It's all very important into the broader ecosystem of what we do, and people acknowledging it as something that's necessary and essential. And again, soapbox moment, we're not going to get very far if we don't start having better dialogue.
It's so true, Lindsey. It is something where I feel like the industry has come a long way.
Yeah.
And I can pick and choose some examples, but the reality, I think, is that a former boss of mine had said to me on an occasion, he said, what you do as a public affairs guy, you talk to all these people all the time and you make sure you know what everybody's thinking and what their concerns are. He said it's very much akin to maintenance on a haul truck or whatever piece of equipment. And I said, okay, I'm not sure I can follow. And he said it's far better to make the daily, weekly, monthly investments in regular maintenance on a haul truck than to have to all of a sudden replace one when there may not be one available. And I think that that's really set with me, is that this ongoing regular conversations, keeping people informed, understanding what their pressure points, what their pain points are, is really powerful. And I've done a few different things in my career, and I think my first real touch point was stakeholder consultation. I worked in public education. And the one thing I learned very quickly about the public is that they're smart, they have great BS detectors, and very often they don't ask complicated questions, but they do deserve answers, and they will not leave until they get those kinds of answers. And so you've got to go into these conversations prepared, and that it is not a cemented position. You have to be somewhat flexible, and you have to understand, and that's where somebody like me can come in, is where there can be a bit of leniency, where we can get a bit more flexibility. And sometimes it's a matter of saying, here's a key point of deliberation that we might have, but at the same time, we could look for an offset here or an offset there. And again, it's always part of a conversation. When I worked in commercial and residential real estate, and my executive chairman scratched his head and he's like, mining, what is the relationship to mining? Well, this was day one after he'd hired me, but there'd been a bit of a gap. And I said, listen, I think there's massive amounts of capital invested. You're digging big giant holes, right? Because you're building shopping centers or condo developments or whatever they happen to be. The difference is that for mining, they've always been off the radar. They've been out of the equation and hidden off the highway. And what we're doing here is in the midst of downtown or wherever it happens to be, they're a little bit less visible when they're a mining entity off the highway, if you will. And I think that this is part of the thing that miners have become a little bit more complacent about, because there wasn't a need to get their story out. It was get my permit and go off and do those things. And that's no longer the case. People flying drones over mine sites and live tweeting, oh gosh, look at this protest. And there's lots of examples of where things have gone particularly poorly. And not just in mining, but in natural resources and forestry. And there's numbers of examples where people cannot see the long or the downstream value of what's being produced. And I think there's also lots of examples of where it's gone really well. But I think getting in and on the table, the relationships that matter, understanding who your stakeholders are, is so fundamental, and yet not always done as particularly well as it could be.
I'm going to ask you an extra hard question now, Steve. I think that often we learn from our failures, or we learn from situations that have not gone well. Outside of your experience with Yamana, where things actually did go fairly well, who else is doing a good job out there that we can call out as examples? Because sometimes it serves as a roadmap. What are they doing that we need to adopt? And even if it's not a holistic scenario, like who's done something well that we can learn from and others can model after?
There's lots of really good examples, I think. I always look to Agnico Eagle here in Canada. They're obviously a massive player. But I think what Sean's been able to do there is also look to where their interests are in Canada's north, in the high Arctic, recognizing that there's opportunity, but there's also an enormous need. And I was up in the Diavik mines years ago, and the CEO sat down and he said, we are investing billions of dollars in this community, and look at what everybody's getting, and the jobs and economic development and all the rest of it. And obviously that's what mining companies can do, right? They operate where nobody else will, and because that's where the geology is. And I think to the same extent is that it's also highlighted for the leadership at Agnico that there's only so much that they can do. There's only so much that they can afford to absorb in terms of not just the economic development, but the social development as well. And I think Sean's been able to use that as a bit of a platform, because it is really his, I hate to use that term, but that's his burning platform, right? It is development in the North. And now what we're seeing from President Trump is that Arctic sovereignty isn't just kind of Canada's backyard, but it's North America's backyard. And we need to have a broader conversation about that. But I've also had conversations with people who live up there and say, I can go to Home Depot in Ottawa or Toronto or wherever and buy a sheet of plywood for $15, but it costs me $150 up there to get it, and it takes me 6 months. And as a country, and other obviously like Nordic countries and things have figured out how to do ice roads and figured out how to build, but we've been really hesitant to build that infrastructure. And I think what we're going to see here in Canada is perhaps a more aggressive conversation and hopefully some action around building that kind of public infrastructure.
That appreciate that you put that into perspective, because I think it's really important. And we touched on building the infrastructure and what mining companies do well, and that we just don't always get it out there front and center. But there are some great examples, and I will attest to Agnico Eagle doing a great job, because I see resumes from people in all different kinds of companies. But I will tell you that the fewest number of resumes that I have ever seen out of any specific company is that. So not only are they doing a good job of what they are supposed to do for their stakeholders, they're keeping their people. And that is huge. I love that you brought that up, because they are my impenetrable company, and that's for a reason.
Yeah, listen, I was just going to say they are a great Canadian success story, but I can also think of on the service and supply side, like there's a company like Major Drilling, who are one of the largest in the world, and they've had enormous success because they're just really good at what they do. They don't try to be more than what they are. They expand their portfolio and things like that. But again, their executive team, I think, just because of age, has changed over a little bit, but people tend to have been there for years and years. And as a mining company, having that kind of stability and those long-term relationships are so fundamental. And I think somebody had coined the phrase for me that engagement and the relationships that come from engagement, it's no longer a phase of a project. It is the project. And I think that's a whole different kind of milieu where mining companies are evolving to. And I think executives, when you really think about having that chief public affairs officer in play who can work with legal, work with finance, work with the operations team. I think of an example when I was with Yamana, that the operations leader called me from Brazil in a community, and he said, I'm not sure what's happening. I said, what? And he said, the new mayor in the town where we operate to work on a cow. And he was an ardent communist and that sort of thing. And I said, oh boy, you guys have had your municipal elections, and he did win, and he didn't know what to do. And I said, just give him a couple of weeks and I'm sure he'll figure it out. And sure enough, within I guess it was probably a couple of months, the mayor made a request of several $1 million for us to build a road that was nowhere near our project. And so I had to hop on a plane and go down and have a conversation with them, because that's a little bit out of our area of operations. But even the most naive politicians will come in and they'll figure things out really quickly. And so there is a protection issue there. And certainly a lot of mining companies will throw the legal framework in play. And I can tell you firsthand, from both having worked in politics and having conversations with politicians a lot, their instinct is leave the lawyers out of the room. We want a relationship, not the finger pointing. And so again, that's where people like me can be really foundational in terms of moving projects forward without the encumbrances of, not to say we would avoid the legal process, but it's negotiating with a gun to your head in many respects.
Yeah. All that said, there's so much out there, and the pace at which news travels is crazy. We have so much information at our fingertips on a routine basis, and you must be seeing tons of it. And just to stay on top of what's going on, from elections to politics to on a global scene, how in the world do you do it?
It's a great question, right? Because if you look at the news media industry as a whole, I think in 2024, you were losing in the United States 2.5 media outlets a week.
Wow.
That there was these enormous, what they call information deserts or news deserts, where people don't have access to local news. And I spend in my consultancy a lot of time talking to executives about how to overcome some of that, because then what you get faced with is algorithm-based information where it's much more difficult to get your message out, because people are fed what it is that they believe in and not necessarily
what they need to, like, news used to be what we needed to hear and not what aligned with whatever political spectrum or interest you have at that moment. And I obviously need some news sources. So
I'll send you my list. Yeah. Listen, I think this is where, from my standpoint, things like AI are going to be fundamentally changing. They will never replace a handshake across the table. But in terms of the ability for public affairs professionals to react faster, to be able to get concise information to executives so that they can make critical decisions in the moment, is paramount, right? But it's also the kind of the underpinning, the foundational pieces of, is this something we need to worry about now, or can we worry about it tomorrow, or are we going to worry about it? What is the materiality of the issue? And so there's got to be those lenses and those filters, right? Because again, if we're reacting to every piece of clickbait we see, you're a lost cause. You'll fundamentally change the nature of your organization if you're just consistently in reaction mode. And that just doesn't serve your stakeholders, your investors particularly well.
You, from my perspective, nailed it. And I think that the idea of reactionary, right? It's rather than being proactive about having a Steve to help manage these relationships, rather than being proactive about an ESG situation. Like, we have to be consistently, there's so much to be aware of in all aspects of what we're doing in mining. But I think we've done a great job traditionally of being reactionary. And now we're pivoting to have to be proactive and paying attention to so many inputs at this point to do it well, to minimize the risk and to carry things forward. And I appreciate that you said reaction, because I use this as an example all the time. You're going to wait for it to be a problem, or you're going to do something about it before it becomes a problem. And we just can't afford to do that.
Yeah, and I think that there's always been, especially in mining, there's been that historic hesitance to put information into the market, into the stakeholder community, because the fear of kind of retaliation, or you're arming your enemy in many respects. And I think, how important it is to, again, whether it's mining or oil and gas or whatever it is, this idea that you have to understand who your stakeholders are, what do they care about, how do you have a conversation with them, right? It's always that first introduction can be really challenging, and understanding the difference between who is actually a stakeholder and who is just in the audience, and who do you need to engage with and who don't you need to engage with. Because again, this isn't an uncommon scenario where you've got your chief legal managing stakeholder relations off the side of her desk, or you've got your CFO managing it off the side of his desk, or you've got whoever the CEO is, he or she is going to be struggling to keep a company moving, and that these are their distraction, but they can shut a project down instantly if you're not careful.
Absolutely. In recognition of time, I want to ask, what have I not asked that individuals leading projects or mining companies or auxiliary groups to supplying the mining industry, what should they be thinking about that they're not, or what areas do they need to be paying attention to from your perspective so that they can mitigate some of the outstanding risk, political or otherwise, that's out there?
Yeah, and I'm going to go back to where we started the conversation, right? Where the volatility in the marketplace is unprecedented, right? Where it is a new, you hate to coin that term, but like, it is a new world order. And we cannot underestimate mining's role in this. And so getting elbows on the table is paramount, because if you're not in that conversation, to your point, there are risks of losses of permitting or legal risks. I think we're on the cusp of seeing some new risks as it relates to expropriation, nationalization, or just federal government investment in projects, which also historically, other than some examples like Chile and others, hasn't gone particularly well. I think we're talking about security and social risks, and you're looking at the broader reputational and ESG risks that, again, if somebody isn't necessarily keeping their thumb on or seeing it as, well, it's just a cost. I don't want to layer in more cost to my organization. I think there's a quote, I think it was Bill Clinton who said, the cost of doing something the same way over and over again is far more than the cost of change. I'm not sure I'm paraphrasing that quite accurately, but the real struggle is the world is moving along and the mining industry needs to keep pace, because there are, as you've noted a number of times in this conversation, enormous opportunities for miners right now. And the question is that how do they make sure that those fundamental changes are in their interest and their shareholders' interests?
Well, and just as you said at the very beginning of our conversation, there were meetings, and ultimately you were hoping that there was going to be much greater change and forward trajectory than there was. And the word that I use all the time is being bold, right? It might not be proven technology, it might not be proven politically, but like at the risk of doing the same thing and finding ourselves all become insane, being a bit bold and saying, hey, I'm going to take a risk and do something that is counter to what we have always done and see if it pays off. Sometimes that risk is far less than just waiting for the proverbial shit to hit the fan. Say, oops, I better react to this. And which, the lesser of two evils, who knows which it is. I appreciate that, like, we've come full circle in our conversation. Is there anything else that I have left out or just flown by that we should touch base on before we close today, Steve?
It's a great question. You're right. We've gone kind of full circle in this conversation. I think for mining companies, there's less of them out there because of a lot of M&A activity. There's been less investment. There's going to be supply chain issues. You're going to have varying expectations from governments, and that could go from speed to ESG requirements to all kinds of things. And really, it's getting somebody with some senior level accountability and authority to help mitigate some of these risks into your shop. I'm starting to see more fractional CPO, Chief Public Affairs Officers, materialize, and that's the nature of the game. But I think it's very difficult to quantify the work that people like I do, but it's very easy to quantify when that work doesn't get done.
1,000%. I don't think I could agree with that anymore. And I so appreciate your vantage point and your ability to step in as a strategic lead with a really strong understanding of how these decisions get made, and also balancing that with a bit of passion for helping the mining industry do better in these very strange and complex times. I have immensely enjoyed our conversation today, and I'm grateful that you chose to join us. So we'll have to do it again as we continue to see what shapes up. But thank you so much again for joining us. And for those of you who are interested in having further conversation, this will all get posted at some point, but you can get in touch with Steve with his LinkedIn here. And as he reminded me, there's also a drummer out there that's a Steve. So make sure that you use this link in order to touch base with Steve.
The other Steve Birch is a guitar player. I'm the drummer.
Oh, drummer, opposite.
Yeah,
sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, we had that whole conversation and I just butchered it. But
all good.
So yeah, again, thank you for being here, and thank you all for listening into us today, and have a wonderful rest of the week.
Thanks for your time, Lindsey. I appreciate it.